everybody for joining our today's second session in the series of workshops for our AHRC funded GenViR network project. Today's session will focus on creative methodologies for researching sensitive topics like GBV in India and other LMIC contexts. And we have three very exciting presentations lined up to kickstart these conversations. I would like to remind everybody that the session is recorded. The intention is that the recordings of the session will be shared on GenViR website and will serve as a learning and learning tool for the future if you want to refer to anything that was presented today later on. The session will be very much like last week, is aimed to stimulate discussion around the topic. So we're ensuring there's ample time for questions, comments, discussions, and sharing people's experiences. Each speaker will present their ideas or their topics for about 10-15 minutes, and there will be an immediate Q&A session with that speaker, and we will have a summative reflection towards the end as well. We aim to use the space again to learn from each other and how best to understand, research, and make change in the difficult and sensitive spaces of gender-based violence. I will introduce our speakers now, not to interrupt them later. So our first speaker is Professor Selina Busby. Is an academic and theatre practitioner who makes performances with community groups and a national teaching fellow. She's a professor of applied and social theatre in the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, where she's also a course leader in the MA Applied Theatre and lead for research ethics and integrity. So her research and practice focuses on theatre that invites the possibility of change. She uses participatory and emancipatory research methods and has worked in the prison settings, youth theatres, and with people living in adverse conditions, both in the UK and internationally. Her research investigates applied theatre with marginalised communities, undertaking in partnerships with theatres, NGOs, youth groups, and grassroots practitioners. Current projects include work with communities living in informal housing settlements and those living with gender-based violence in India. And her recent publications include Applied Theatre, a Pedagogy of Utopia with Methuen, if I'm saying that correctly, and the Routledge Companion to the Theatre of Young People, co-edited with Kelly Freebody and Charlene Rajendran for Routledge. Thank you. So I apologize for any mistakes in pronunciation. She's currently writing a book that investigates the punk ethos and underpins applied theatre practice. Our next speaker will be Dr. Andy Barrett, who is a theatre maker and researcher. His company, Excavate, has been making work with communities across East Midlands and beyond for the last 25 years. And we have worked very closely together as well in a number of projects in India from about 2018, 2017, Andy. So it's fantastic to have him here to speak about his work. And finally, last but not least, we have Dr. Antonia Liguori, who is a senior lecturer in applied storytelling and MA storytelling program director at Loughborough University in the UK. Over the past 20 years, she has the privilege of experience a very diverse and exciting career pathway in the cultural sector and media industry in Italy and in academia in the UK. She has been drawn to the space where education and technology intersect and opportunities for methodological innovation arise. Having been immersed in a truly interdisciplinary environment provided her with a broad range of skills and knowledge that have allowed her to develop a growing international reputation and a record of excellence in research, teaching, and enterprise, with the field of digital storytelling applied within experimental pedagogy and educational psychology. Her research has been focusing on three main strands: digital storytelling in formal and non-formal education, co-creation, participation, and resilience to address environmental issues, and applied storytelling and mental health literacy. Since 2015, having joined HEART, the Healing Education Animation Research Therapy, she has been exploring digital storytelling as a therapeutic intervention, and more recently, its application within social prescribing. In the past 5 years, she has been involved as a principal investigator and a co-investigator in more than 20 projects in various sizes, ranging from a few thousand euros over €1 million in value, funded by AHRC, NERC, ESRC, MRC, and the European Commission. So these are our wonderful, wonderful speakers. Thank you very much for joining. And I will hand off to Selina to kickstart. the conversation.
Thank you, Nadia. And now I have to work out how to share screen. I should have done that in advance. Have I got the rights to be able to do
yes,
that?
Yes.
Great.
There's just a green button at the bottom.
Yeah, I then just have to get my PowerPoint to come up.
Yep.
It's mostly photographs, I promise.
That's all right.
There we go. Does that what? Hold on, let's do share. I need to do the slideshow from the beginning. Oh, and now I need to swap screens. Sorry, this
That's okay.
is slightly more technical than I like to be. There we go. I think that's right.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for your patience with that. And I now need to put a clock there so I don't overrun the 15 minutes. I'm going to talk today a little bit about the ethos that underpins my theatre making practice in community settings. Rather than tell you what happens in those spaces, I'm going to talk about the sort of philosophy that I use that underpins that. So the only slide I have with very many words is this one, which basically outlines what I'm going to say really quickly. And I've got lots of photographs because I'd rather you looked at the photographs than me, because I get very nervous doing this. So when I talk about my theatre and drama practice and research, I say that my version of theatre is based on the politics of dignity. And that this in turn is achieved through 5 things: deeply embedded partnerships, the construction of third spaces that rely on equitable dialogue and mutual respect, articulation and amplification, and geographies of resistance that create disruption by presence and are an invitation to resist social, spatial, and cognitive justice. So that's kind of the academic way of describing what I'm about to talk about, but I'm going to talk about it in a much more less theoretical way than that might imply. So for the last 18 years, actually 19 years this year, I've been working in a variety of different contexts in Mumbai with what Arjun Appadurai might describe as bare citizens. My work with bare citizens isn't just in India, it also happens in the UK and a variety of other international contexts. But I particularly like Appadurai's description of bare citizens, as it refers to people who have literally been stripped of most of their citizenship. So they have few rights, they have lack of access to sanitation, to education, to voting rights, to political documentation to prove who they are and where they're from. And it's a useful expression to describe who most of my work happens with. I'm talking specifically about context in India. Most of my work happens in 3 informal housing settlements: Dharavi, West Malad, and Worli Kolliwader. And I'm going to talk very specifically about 3 projects that aren't connected to this particular gender-based violence project and network, but are connected to the type of work we've been doing through theatre as part of the network. So the first one of those 5 principles is partnerships and integrated investment. And all of the work that I do in any context involves being involved in long-term partnerships in the places that I work. So as an example, the first of the 3 projects that are listed on this slide with the young theatre makers of Dharavi, that work started 18 years ago, and that work and the work with those young people has continued, so that some of the young people that we were working with 18 years ago now will have worked on the second project, the Women of Worli Kolliwader, and also with the third project, which is quite new. So just as a really clear example of that, this is the project partner team, really, and participants and co-researchers and the team. So this person here, who you might be able to see that my cursor is on, is my lead partner. This is Divya Bhate, and this is our long-term translator. He's not really a translator, he's a theatre director in his own right, Satish Demby. And the other people in this photograph are the young people that started with us 18 years ago and come back and work with us very often, particularly Sana here and Kishan here, who are very definitely lead practitioners. So they started as young people on the project who might have been 14, 15 at the time. Now they're in their mid to late 20s, early 30s, and are our co-researchers and co-practitioners on the projects that happen as a result of that. This is a brief snapshot of the women of Worley-Collywadder. I'll talk more about them in just a minute. And this is the young people of Uva. I'm going to go back to Worley-Collywadder. So Worley-Collywadder hasn't been running for 18 years. We ran a project in Worley-Collywadder with this group of women for 5 or 6 years. And out of that project, we then developed work with the Uva, which is, as I said on an earlier slide, which is the Youth for Unity and Volunteer Action Group. This group of remarkable young people come from 6 or 7 different informal housing settlements, and they were recruited to this project as theatre makers and also as co-researchers. So on anything that we write and publish on this particular project, they will all be listed as our co-writers and co-researchers formally, which has become more and more important to the work that I do and the way that we disseminate it. So that integrated partnership, key principle, 18 years worth of work, it's deeply embedded in community settings. And I guess the other thing to say about that is that I don't ever facilitate the drama work myself. That's not quite true. I did this year for the first time, and only a tiny part of it because these young people wanted me to. The Indian practitioners and researchers deliver the work. I kind of produce it and work very closely with the on-the-ground grassroots practitioners, but it's very definitely practice that's devised between all of us and that quite often happens in a language that I don't speak. So I very, very rarely facilitate it. My second principle is that I would try to work in what I call third spaces. And if anybody's interested in the theory, I draw on the theorists that are listed here to create a third space. The best way for me to describe what a third space is this photograph. There's a lot of talk in applied theatre about safe spaces and brave spaces. I don't think either of those exist in real world contexts. What we try to create on the work that I make is third spaces where we bring people together from different cultures and different backgrounds, where everybody comes together in complete equity, and where no one voice is more important than another voice. And I use this photograph as a way of symbolizing that. In this photograph, it's very clearly, to anybody who's familiar with theatre spaces, it's definitely a drama studio. It has a drama studio floor and curtains, and everybody's taken their shoes off, very typically applied theatre. But the shoes are really interesting to me because I can recognise every pair of shoes in this photograph and who they belong to. So I know who my co-facilitators and my students' shoes are. I know which participants own which shoes, and I like to think that none of those shoes have any hierarchy in the process at all. They're equal shoes. They're on an equal footing in a way so that you can't tell who's more important or who isn't more important. And that's exactly the way that the drama spaces we create should feel. So that any one moment you might not know who's facilitating or researching. It might be one of the community participants. It might be a long-term theatre director. It might occasionally be myself. It might be a student. It might be the women from Worley-Collywadder. But everybody's voice and everybody's arts practice is equally important. And we harness everybody's skills and expertise to make theatre and at the same time conduct research. So I don't really need to expand on that, but so equitable dialogue and mutual respect, whether we're making site-specific performance, as we are here, about lack of space, whether we're having deep conversations about gender-based violence, as we are in this slide, or whether we are considering what makes good theatre and what doesn't make good theatre in connection with research, as we are in this photograph. Third pillar of my work, aspirational thinking. All of the work that I conduct when it's our research, not my research, but in my co-researchers' work, looks at aspirational thinking, which is based around if you can imagine things differently, then that's a start to making things change. So in the communities that we work with, for example, these women wanted to change in Worley-Collywadder, wanted to change the way they use the spaces that they have access to, or in fact, they don't have access to. So their aspirational thinking, created through a series of drama workshops and research investigating lack of space and spatial justice, resulted in their aspirational thinking being around the idea that they wanted to use communal spaces to teach each other and learn from each other. And this slide comes from a piece of site-specific performance where they were explaining that to the rest of their community. In a similar way, this piece of theatre that happens without an audience, with the young people from Daravi, is in a theatre space with no audience, but what their aspirational thinking is about making performances about what it might look like to insist that as a girl you're allowed to go to university and have an education in your own right. And so by creating drama about it, they then start to think about the possibilities of that when they might not have thought about that in the past. None of the themes of the work come from me or the team, or the outside team. All of the themes for the work that we research and makes comes from the communities that we work with. So this particular group wanted to explore lack of education for university education for girls and access to education more generally. We're back to the women of Worli Collywater exploring how they want to use the space. I can't remember why I put that slide in there. That's I'm just going to move on from that. Nearly there. Fourth pillar of my work is about articulation and amplification. And I know Bell Hooks doesn't use capitals for her name, but my PowerPoint wouldn't let me take them off, which is really annoying. So part of the aspirational thinking is that if people can articulate what they want in spaces that are third spaces where they feel that they can voice that, then becomes the possibility of amplification or making those voices louder and in places where change might happen. So in this particular piece of theatre, these women are, although you can't necessarily tell this from the photograph, making pieces of theatre about two things. One, lack of sanitation and what they want toilet blocks to look like in their spaces. And as a result of this work, they then designed toilet blocks in sanitation in the way they wanted it to look like, rather than the way that council might want it to look like. In the same space, they were also making theatre about their concerns for their children who are addicted to the use of mobile telephones. In both cases, they claimed they hadn't had those conversations until they could do that in a third space using drama to communicate that to each other. And as a result of some of those conversations, they are now in dialogue with local councils to physically change the building of toilets, which is great. These young people are the young people of UVA. That is their new project. They're researching a variety of different issues. One of them is very clearly from this photograph about gender-based violence. One of them is about lack of education for girls. And one of them is about young men being restricted by the traditions of their communities and their fathers and their own wish for change. So lots of this work isn't performed in public spaces. It's a space for them to articulate to each other their feelings and their thoughts. And then if they feel that they want to, the amplification of that comes through a performance to a more public audience if they choose to. This group of young people is particularly interesting to me because they are part of this project because they are training at the same time as doing drama with us. They're training with us to facilitate this work, which they will then take back into their own communities. So their remit for this project is they research with us, then they take the research into their communities and they repeat the type of work that they've been doing with us, with their own communities, to discover what the young people that they from their communities want to talk about, what changes they want made in their lives, and then think about concrete ways of making that happen. Last point, geographies of resistance. It's really important, I think, that the people that I work with, wherever that is in the world, that they think about this work in a political way and think about making change. Just by bringing the women from Worli Collywater into a posh theatre space gives them a sense of their resisting a whole variety of restraints that are put on them for culturally, financially, economically and socially. By taking them into a really nice theatre space and letting them play in that space, they're resisting how people who usually use that space might think about that space. So their presence in that space is a disruption to the art goers who usually use the theatre space. Their presence performing site-specific theatre about their lack of space itself in public is also a disruption that hopefully creates dialogue and conversations that ripple out from the groups that we're working with. And nearly always we don't dictate what any of the themes of the work or the research are, but every time that we work with any group of marginalized people, the issues that frequently come up through drama and through discussions revolve around social justice, spatial justice, and cognitive justice. And there they are, disrupting the presence. They're disrupting by their presence in a theatre space. The cognitive justice is what I'm going to end on. Cognitive justice and the co-research element of the work is really important to me. As a researcher, my voice is no more or less important than the voices of these people and their lived experiences. And my current fight academically is to disseminate the work so that these, particularly the young people in this slide here, have completely joint ownership over all of the work. They have ownership over how I present it, where I present it, how it's written about, where they present it, and anything. It's beyond consent. They all consent to being in the project, they all consent to be part of the research. But the flip for that for me at the moment is that they own the data, they own the research, whether that piece of research is a piece of drama they've created with us, or whether it's the dialogue they have with their own communities. It's their data, not anybody else's. The things that I've missed are, I haven't talked about how we make theatre, and what might be surprising is that part of the theatre making is walking. We spend a lot of time walking through spaces that communities want to share with us. They tell stories in those spaces about how they use their spaces. And even more important than that is eating together, where some of the most important dialogues happen, and playing together. Because if we just talk about social justice, spatial justice and co-researchers, it sounds really dry and really not fun, and it sounds really heavy. But actually, without the fun, without the play, without the food, without the walks, none of the final performances or accumulative performances that are part of the work and part of the research would happen. So we always, as applied theatre people, don't touch enough on the fun. So the route of getting to the difficult conversations, the route of being able to explore complicated issues is in fun, and that's how we always start. I've rattled through that really quickly, and I'm going to stop. Thank you for listening.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much, Selina. So many things covered in this, and I have so many questions, but I'm going to be quiet and I'm going to give this space to our audience to provide comments, questions to Selina about her talk.
Selina, can I ask a question, please?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes.
So I think it's wonderful, and I know we have touched around some that we haven't actually spoken with the last couple of years or so. But again, wonderful work and long-standing work that you actually carry on in that area. I just wanted to actually ask, all those 18 years of work that you've had, the kind of networks that you've actually made, the kind of contacts and the kind of stories that you've collected, all those things. I know that this has had a major impact, but I just wanted to get some kind of an idea from you in relation to the kind of impact it has had in their own lives, or also in terms of the wider society or policy impacts.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. I never want to say that theatre changes the world, because it doesn't, and it can't. I sometimes think it can change individual lives, and I think the impact is how I would describe it. So if I think about that photograph of those young people stood in the dark, when we started working with those young people, they themselves declared that the limits of their world were the outskirts of Daravie. I mean, and that's huge. It's a city within a city, but that they didn't have ambitions of doing things beyond those walls. And I would never say that the impact is the fact that we've been there and making this work with them, but they say that developing confidence through working in theatre, and particularly through working with people in an international group, gave them the confidence to think there was more things possible than they originally thought. And actually, if I go down that list of people now, I can look at the one who has his own theatre company, who does work all year round in the same way that we do, who creates the funding for it and makes that happen. One of those young people completed a master's in social work 2 years ago and directly attributes that to the work, and currently is employed by the staff as a staff member of GenViR. So and she says similar things, that came directly out of this work. There is one of them is a GP, a general practitioner, who's trained as a paediatrician, who works directly in Darrowby with his own community. They also all still make theatre. I can't say that the work directly creates that change or directly makes that impact, but they often say that themselves. I think we played a small part in that. There are more concrete examples of change. GenViR have used the walking method and storytelling method to create a walk through several of the informal housing communities within Mumbai, for young people to tell stories for paying customers, so tourists, but also, more importantly than that, for council workers, for architects, for trainee architects, to talk about why the formation of the informal housing settlement in its current format is so important to them, and why moving people into tower blocks, which is the government's aim, isn't appropriate for them. And so, as a really tangible result of this sort of work, some of the trainee architects are doing that tour with young people and going, we have to change how we're thinking about building cities. We have to change how we think about providing services, and not just bulldozing areas and moving people into tower blocks. So there is concrete change often, but the impacts aren't quite as straightforward as, here we did a piece of theatre or a piece of research about that, here is the answer. I guess the other one that I would talk about with GenViR in particular is during COVID. One of the projects that we won't really disseminate is about gender-based violence, and is about lack of educational opportunities. During COVID, in some of the informal housing settlements, life became more restrictive for some of the young women in particular that we were working with, and they created, through storytelling and drama, created a network of support for each other and a network of helplines, so that they could tell stories in various different ways, and nobody suspected what was actually being the content of those stories. And so informal networks of support and help and signposting to further help, and to NGOs that might be able to do things practically, was a very definite outcome of some of the work during COVID. Sorry, that's a really long answer.
That's fine. Thank you. Thank you for that.
More questions, comments? Or people are thinking. I do have one, because you mentioned language, and to me that was quite interesting in terms of working across languages, both quite literally in India particularly, you know, the multiplicity of different languages and heritages and everything as it kind of come together, and west to kind of Indian context, language and concepts and everything. I said whether you had a comment about kind of finding a common language in the space of theatre, in the space of the work that you do with community.
Yes and no. We quite often have 3 or 4 different languages spoken in the space, and community members will translate for each other. If we have the wonderful Satish with us, he will translate between several of them sometimes. But actually, a lot of the work happens by reducing the need for language. So a piece of theatre doesn't necessarily, whether it's a polished performance piece or a devised piece just for the community that are in that space at that time, doesn't need a lot of words. Body language, facial expressions and tone of voice convey a huge amount of information. So we've had moments where somebody has translated a performance to me from young people, and they're whispering every single word that's said, and I can quite easily go, actually, I don't need the translation. There are odd bits that I might do, but there is something about the way that theatre and performance works that you often don't need that. And we work with very simplistic, on some levels, theatre that does often distill things down to still images or slightly moving still images that you don't need the words for. When we're translating the research elements, that becomes harder, but that's also why we always have translators on the project. I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, it's the practical things, isn't it, in terms of how do you come together? But I think your point about, you know, how much of it is nonverbal and how much of you reduce, how much human connection you can make without kind of language being a barrier.
I would say a lot of human connection without language. But actually, if I just go back to Raghu's question really briefly, one of the things that the young people from Dharavi really, which I find really difficult, actually, I find it politically really unpleasant, but they really say that the use of English in the room was really beneficial for them. I politically, I find that really uncomfortable, but they say that being able to be comfortable with speaking English has opened doors for them. And although the aim of the project was never to teach English, that lots of them have picked up lots of English, and as a result of that, they have access to different education forms, to different access to different parts of the city, different parts of life. And so I'm having to learn to embrace that actually having English in the room is also a useful thing.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you. Any other questions? Well, we'll have a kind of summative discussion at the end as well. So thank you, Selina. And yeah, if we move on to Andy then.
Hello. I'll pick up on a couple of things that were said at the end there from Selina about the kind of image and thinking practically, a little bit more practically perhaps. So I've been working on what I call community theatre for most of my working life, and for a large part of that's been with my theatre company Excavate, and throughout that time we work with communities, usually communities of place, to explore questions of culture and heritage, tensions and aspirations, and to create usually, but not always, theatrical shows to present kind of what we've discovered together. And during that time, particularly in the earlier 2000s, we were asked by a number of local government organisations mainly to run projects that had explicitly social agendas around such things like teenage pregnancy and knife crime, and we turned those down because at that point we just weren't interested in seeing our work as being this kind of social, what we saw as kind of social amelioration in this kind of highly instrumentalized way. But as time has gone on, we've begun to work a lot more with smaller groups, and although a lot of our work is still based around stories of culture and heritage, we found ourselves working with what you may describe as vulnerable groups. So new arrivals to the UK as asylum seekers and refugees, and on a range of health-based projects, which you mentioned, Nadia, two of which have been in India, one of which was exploring questions of mental health resilience in a basti, the Barrett Basti in Pune, and one around mental health literacy in Kerala. And both of those were predicated on seeing the theatre work as a research tool rather than as a dissemination device. And that was kind of central because of the way that we place ourselves in connection to the communities that we work with, and on two very important considerations. The first is that we don't see the community we're working with as this kind of coherent, predefined body that's got a label attached to it, like teenage mums or victims of knife crime. Yeah, when they arrive, they're not a community yet. They'll become one in the process of the work. And the second is that those people that come are the people who've got the knowledge and the expertise. And the job, our job as practitioners, is to help them to reveal that knowledge and expertise through using the language of theatre, which by using both the speech, by both being able to use speech and the body, and this is what makes it specific, is an incredibly potent one. And in other words, what we do is we use the theatre to develop a form of research language that we can then listen to, and hopefully people will respond to. And it's worth thinking briefly, I think, about what the specific power of theatre is, what theatre can do that no other art form can do at all. It just can. Is that it can put in a space simultaneously worlds and times. separate worlds and separate times can literally be present in that moment in a space spontaneously, as can inner thoughts and the social world. They can just be there, bam. You can't do that with any other form. You can't do it with film unless you split the screen. And you can. In a novel, you can't do it because you read sequentially. So you can't unless all the text is there and you're reading everything all at once. Only theatre has that power to put all of those things to coexist. It's kind of an intense thing, and it demands quite an imaginative and interpretive response from the audience, but they get it and they can do it and they can read it. And that gives theatre this incredibly potent ability that no other art form has. And just going back to this idea of, what we talked about at the beginning about cultural context and working across different cultural contexts, theatre also, because it draws on so many aspects, singing, dancing, costume, whatever, it has a really good ability to grab bits and weave together aspects of local cultural forms really swiftly and quickly that helps create communicative bonds with audiences that, like, more simple forms of message giving or interrogative practice can. So there are three things I wanted to think about, really. One was this idea of vulnerable communities. One was the idea of the challenge of sensitive topics. And the other was this idea of methodological orientations rather than the idea of methodologies. And all of those I want to kind of go through this prism of seeing any group that you work with as a heterogeneous body that you don't determine beforehand in your practical work, even if you have done so in identifying your participant research base. You know in your head, oh, these are people that come on this project because we're studying this issue. Yeah. When those people arrive in the room, you need to drop that at that moment. And it's like, right, we now have an incoherent community in some ways. And also that they are absolutely expert and knowledgeable. And I think why I liked the term methodological orientations is because anyone who teaches applied theatre knows that much of the practice is actually based on understandings and principles. Some of the things that Selina talked about voice and agency and participation and power, amongst other things. And that when you come to teach the work or try to talk about it, you realize that there aren't that many kind of methodologies, really. There aren't that many practitioners who have set down like this kind of body of work that you can draw on, that you can go to and look at and go, how do I do this? How do I do this? Yeah. Which is why Augusto Boal is so important, because he did. And his work, The Theatre of the Oppressed, as it is collectively known, is a kind of coherent and practical form of practice that is absolutely predicated on handing over power to those who are participating and creating exercises and games that allow people to find ways to express and explore and communicate their lives. Now, I don't know in this virtual room that we have here who knows about Boal. I'm assuming that a lot of us do, but we may not. So briefly, he was heavily influenced by an educator, a Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, who said that to exist humanly is to name the world, to change it. And the kind of education that Freire was interested in and demanded was one that enabled people to develop their power to critically perceive the way they exist in the world. And in doing so, he said that they come to see the world not as a static reality, but as a reality that is always in process, that's in transformation. And that means instead of asking what do teachers need to teach students, you're more thinking what problems do teachers need to pose to students from which they can name and transform their world. And that's the kind of underlying principle behind Boal's work, that you create a process that allows the participants to study the situation that they're in and then let them decide if they want to change it. And I want to mention some specific methods and exercises of Boal's to illustrate why the work is so useful in confronting the challenge of working around sensitive topics with what we might define as vulnerable communities. I want to first talk about a project I was involved in Kerala, which was working with highly stigmatized communities. I've got some pictures to make this work. Yeah, is that on? Is that good? Can you see that? Yeah,
yeah,
that's good.
Perfect.
Great.
Yeah.
And it was working in partnership with 2 mental health organisations who provide community clinics across the state of Kerala. And the project was to explore the applicability and the promotion of mental health literacy in urban and rural communities using participatory theatre and storytelling practices. And it was a large-scale project, 3-year project that began with this collection of over 200 narrative interviews with people that use the community clinics and their families and those who worked in the clinics. And they sought to understand how people understood the experiences they were going through and the kind of interventions and help they sought to address questions of mental illness and the familial and social responses to these. And as part of the theatre team, and we were kind of quite a small team compared to the amount of kind of medical practitioners involved in the team, we knew that we had to establish the theatre as a research language, as an interrogative tool, rather than as a tool of dissemination. And the first thing we wanted to do was to show how we could use theatre to create discussion, not between patients and families and staff of the clinic, so between kind of different stakeholders. And so that to do that, we drew on these concepts that I'm kind of trying to posit, you know, the idea of the kind of coherent/non-coherent community, and of the participants being the experts in the room. So that meant 2 things. So we made a show, which I'll talk about briefly in a minute, that we took out to these clinics. And when we arrived in these clinics, which had patients in, theatre people in, doctors in, maybe some community members, we needed to create this community at that point. We needed to show that everyone that entered that room was there on equal terms, that we were starting afresh at that moment in this new endeavour, in which past experience at that point was although we were drawn it wasn't important in establishing any kind of hierarchy. And that meant asking the audience to participate in a couple of simple activities that would use later in the performance. Little games, really. Now, as anyone who works in applied theatre will be aware, games are a hugely important part of working with communities. And game is a really disarmingly simple term for what are often very complex little machines doing really important work, because they serve to build relationships. They show that in this space we may be exploring serious issues, but we are doing so playfully, and they're about and doing that with the support and the care of each other. And they also, and this is very important again when thinking about Boalian methodology, often focus on the body and encourage us to use the body in ways that we're perhaps not used to. And that can be a really democratizing process, because it gets rid of language with all the terms associated with language that have hierarchies of power embedded in that language. And they also encourage spontaneity in responding swiftly to challenges rather than pondering what's right and what's wrong. And the second concept we kind of brought into this was this idea that the audience were expert. Okay, so Boal's main invention is this thing called theatre of the oppressed. And it has at its centre this idea of forum theatre. And in that, what happens is a performance is created that is shared, that explores a particular issue, one in which a central protagonist, faced with some form of oppression or some challenge to their life, is unable to overcome that oppression or that challenge. And the performance is shown to the audience, and then it's handed over to the audience so they can interrogate that and try to resolve the issue at hand. Usually what happens is the audience for the play are those that are facing a similar issue to the protagonist. Actually, let's move through some of these slides. Can I do that? Yeah, oh, there you go. There's another one. I'll just kind of flip through these. And the event is managed by a person who takes on the role of what is called a joker. And their job is for the audience to not merely to suggest solutions to what they've seen, but to come up on stage, to take the role of the protagonist and try and influence the action so that a better outcome is produced. And the actors have to improvise around that idea, still remaining in character and playing their social role, with a real commitment. But that's it. That's how it becomes a form of conversation, by doing it, by embodying it, by rehearsing it, by playing it. And it becomes a form of rehearsal for social change. And it allows people to explore tactics and approaches in an embodied way, as I said, rather than just sitting around and talking about it. And we didn't do that in the clinic play, but we drew on some of their ideas. And it was also worth mentioning here that this play was faced with a challenge of being performed in very different cultural contexts, which informed the social pressures that were impacting on people's mental health and the kinds of interventions that they saw. And it was very important that in showing their experiences that they had told us about, that these were accurately reflected. Yeah, therefore these different cultural contexts were really important. And so what we did was we created a template that allowed us to adapt thematically to the different settings we were in. Basically, we created a simple structure in which a character and their family faces a challenge. This precipitates a mental health illness that's treated in a variety of ways. And then, having reached a point where they feel they're ready to re-enter society, they find that because of stigma, they can't. They're blocked from doing that. They cannot move forward. They're stuck, at which point they move to the audience to ask for their help. What can we do? What can we do? It's just pictures in the play, and then eventually, we go out into the audience. What are we going to do? How can you help us? And the researchers were really, not really, they were surprised at the impact of the performance in stimulating debate and conversation, of how people that they had been told would not speak did so, that they felt validated to do so. And in doing so, they became part of the research rather than the subject, just merely the subjects of the research. And it allowed the research to move from being this collection of individual accounts into like collective experience. And through that to become a social story, to create community and collectivity by the very act of sharing it, which is, I think, is really important. And very often these projects are about the production of knowledge, but it's also really important, as Selina said, to think about the ownership of knowledge. And with this, by opening up the conversation, it creates the potential for other groups of people to take up the debate and to shape whole new sets of questions. And it's usually the questions, those whole new sets of questions, that really creates the kind of new forms of knowledge. They may be very different ones to what we have as academic researchers. Now, the play that we made was rather crude. We made it in a hurry, and yet these few simple rules of breaking down the distance between the audience and the play by involving the audience in some way, and using local cultural forms, in placing the audience in the role as experts, as those with the most knowledge in the room. It was really highly effective, just with those few simple rules. But this was a project that was based on a theatre play being created by a theatre team going into a theatre to perform in front of an audience. And of course, much applied work doesn't do that, as Selina was saying. It works with people to uncover and explore stories of challenges. And the very act of doing of that may be enough. It may have no interest in kind of sharing its work with a public audience at all. So how do you approach that? How do you encourage and ask people to share what may be deeply troubling experiences? Going back to that that question. And the answer in some ways is usually practice, by trial and error, by doing this kind of work over and over and over again over many years, and developing an array of very simple and intuitive strategies, in which the main thing is you have to learn to listen, you have to be open to a variety of views, you have to be respectful of people, never ever to patronize, about having an openness to others, which is really an aptitude as much as a competence. It's like an aptitude that you that by doing it over and over again, you kind of develop micro strategies of your own. But and there are no shortcuts. But coming back to a while again, the answer, I think, very often comes back to this idea of the game. Of the game being this fundamental building block of the process, of the game that then develops into an exercise, which is a more structured form of game when content is being produced, and then the exercise turning into something more considered still. And there is always an arc to this. There is always an arc to this. The first games that you play, and again, it goes back to this idea of the non-coherent community, just expecting when people turn up, oh yeah, we know who you are. Your people, you know, they're experiencing this and that. Yeah. In the first, you have to discover that. You have to find, let the community, let those people define themselves. The first games you play should never ask people to reveal themselves. You have to build that up carefully so that nobody's asked to be in the spotlight unless they are confident in being so. It's up to them, through those people, through the workshop process, to discover and express the commonality that you know that you're there to kind of, as researching, to address in some ways. Games allow for non-intrusive investigation, and they then move into a space where participants are asked to express their thoughts and opinions. That's the kind of trajectory always. Building the community, then go, right, now we're a community, now we feel safe. What are our thoughts? What are our opinions? And the theatre, being an embodied art form, allows the body to be a key tool in this. So coming back again to Boal, applied theatre uses a whole array of exercises that are often bundled up in this term image theatre, where people are asked to sculpt images using their own and others' bodies to create still pictures that represent moments from their lives, or representations of abstract ideas such as power, coercion, hope, strength, loneliness. They can represent idealized images or images that relate to a person's past experiences, and they're done swiftly, often silently. And then very often, once you have these images that have been created, they're what Boal calls, you dynamize them. They come to life through a sequence of movement-based and interactive exercises. You allow them to kind of develop into kind of ways of kind of expanding on these. I think, yeah, I'll quickly, if I've got time to, how long have I got?
Really, you don't really. Sorry, Andy. I think
that's fine. In which case, that's absolutely fine. Apologies for going on too long. Okay. So yeah, just one thing I wanted to say at the end, which we've not spoken about. How we leave the space is really important, and I've been really aware in research projects that is something that I think is underexplored. If we spend time building a community, then we have to really think about how we, if you like, dismantle that community, how that community is left, and that is often really, really missed with this work. And as Selina said, because it can have such an impact on people, to then just leave, it is really, really bad. So that's something I think we need to be aware of. Okay, cool.
Brilliant.
I'll stop there.
Thank you, Andy. Fantastic talk and fantastic overview of sort of theoretical and methodological thoughts on working in theatre spaces in communities. We have time for maybe 1-2 questions. Harjinder, you have a question about interpretation of images. I don't know whether you wanted to come in, and then Benita.
Lovely. Well, great work. And I think Andy's understanding of community development is really, really good, by the way. It's really good to see that I had a background in that many years ago. So my question was really about the images. So when you interpret the images that, you know, you produce, does the participant have a role in that sort of interpretation of the images and analysis, or is it the researcher that does most of that, or the therapist?
It's all about the participants interpreting the images. You know, what does this image mean to you? What does this show? If this image is made, who would you be in this image? If you know, who would you replace in this image? If you wanted to build on this image, what is missing from this image? What can we add to this image?
Right.
going to start now. But if I was to put my hand above this person's head in this image, what would they be saying? What would that person be saying? If we wanted to move this from an image of lack of power, and we had to make 5 changes to move it to shift the position of power from this person to this person, what might they be? It's all about the participants using each other's bodies and using their own bodies to explore these questions that you want to explore.
So there's no role of the whatever the Western researcher thinks doesn't come into it at all. It is solely.
Well, it's not that. I mean, I suppose I'm thinking of the Western researcher as the Western researcher would be in the room working as a practitioner, if you like, to help that process. But presumably, you would be observing that and be fascinated and interested in what was being said. Of course, there might be certain questions that you might have, that you might want to ask, and then that would impact on the kind of the exercises that you played and the games that you played to lead to the kind of images, if you like, that were being made.
That's great. Thank you. Now, my methodology is IPA, and it's sort of got some resemblances in terms of what you do, but it's pictorial, so it's just really interesting. Right. Thank you.
Okay.
And if we have a question from Benita as well, if you can unmute and maybe ask that.
I'm just very curious about how you go about enrolling community members to be a part of research projects, especially that run long term. And I sometimes imagine the challenge to be the first part, right, where getting them to understand what the research may be about or what you're really trying to introduce to the community. So I'm just wondering what happened, some of the strategies you've used to maybe build those networks, and the challenges that came in that process, especially the communities that Selina mentioned, because there's so much complexity in all those communities that you've mentioned. So I just, and I know a lot of NGOs and like a lot of partnerships are already happening in there. So like, how do you like make way through that?
If I open this maybe for all speakers as well. So Andy, if you go in, but then if Selina and Antonia want to add as well.
Yeah, I mean, and I think probably Selina and Antonia would have more experience of this than me, to be honest. So, because it's an incredibly difficult challenge, I think, and particularly depending on what it is, what the research is, if you like, what the research question is, in terms of how you explain, what it is you're doing and what they're getting out of it. What is the barter here? Why these people want to come into this space? What are they going to get from it? I mean, I don't know, Selina or Antonia, because whenever I've worked, the kind of in terms of more, in terms of the projects in India and generally working with more marginalized groups, very often the people, by the time I arrive, the group has been roughly formed. So I've not been earlier on in the process so involved in that. I don't know if either of you two have. Selina, have you been? I don't know, maybe not. So I'm not trying to thrust it on you.
No, that's fine. I was waiting to see if Antonia wanted to say something. I'm really aware that we haven't heard from her yet, and I don't want to preempt anything she might say. Sometimes in my work and my practice, we don't start with the research. Quite often the research will emerge from a different perspective. It's quite complex. So sometimes it's about offering a space for women, let's randomly say, women to come together and play. And NGOs are like the long-term embedded partnership thing is really important with that. So, and lots of NGOs and lots of partners will know the sort of work that I'm interested in doing and my partner on the ground, who is from Mumbai and lives in Mumbai when he's not doing this work elsewhere, he kind of advertises, for want of a better way of describing it, and then sometimes, and then the research question will literally emerge as, so my broad question when if I put my researcher hat on is, what impact, going back to Raghu's question, what impact in the world can theatre really have? but I don't know where the community group's going to take that. So people come because they're interested or they're curious. In the case of my work, which has been happening for such a long time, people come because it's word of mouth. I went on this thing and I had a really amazing time, and it was funny and it was lovely, and it was a space that's not like a normal space, and we talked about important stuff. So that kind of thing happens. Sometimes it's much more direct, and sometimes a community will reach out to Divya because he's on the ground and say, we really want to look at this subject and we want to look at it with you. The Yuva work developed exactly because of that. The young people wanted to use theatre to see what they could do to help the communities in which they live in. So that's one of the advantages of it being long-term embedded work and not research projects that have a specific outcome or question at the beginning, if that makes sense. The trick is getting that funded.
Yeah, I would actually jump on this question to probably restructure my whole presentation, because I think it's a very important question. And I think what you were saying, I was taking notes while you were talking, Selina and Dandy, so I think I need to change everything, because I think all the points you've been mentioning are quite essential. And this is one of those, the long-term partnerships. And I think we should go always back, remember that we are human beings before being researchers. And therefore, the thing that makes partnerships more successful is actually human connections and creating those spaces for us as human beings to come together. And also, it's something that is a bit of a reverse process that is not going there with a predefined research question. But what is more successful in terms of long-term partnerships is actually trying to sit down together and identify those issues together, and therefore trying to use what we would call technically co-design principles, but in a more humane language would be just having a conversation and seeing together what is possible to change for the benefit of that particular community. And so I'm just, Nadia, if you agree, I can just
yeah.
So my own journey within this project is actually something that started a long time ago. So my own background is in history, in contemporary history, and I always had an interest in oppression and how people react to oppression. I was studying contemporary history between the two wars, in particular in Italy, where we had dictatorship. And there was this huge dominant narrative around, power. And therefore, I've been always struggling within history as a discipline to identify tools that could enable, the counter narratives to emerge. And this is how I discovered digital storytelling with the transition through social history and oral history. And then I realized how creativity is a great way of actually combining something beautiful that the human body contain in the same space, that is knowledge and sentiments and feelings. So how can we learn better to not repeat what happened, or to make sure that everyone else is aware of what happened by using our sentiments? And I think that creativity, and in particular storytelling and other, of course, the beautiful work that our colleagues are doing, has this incredible power to make people come together and have conversations in a very natural way. So the tool I've been using over the past 20 years is called digital storytelling. It's something that is globally recognized as a practice-based methodology in research, but mainly is a grassroots movement that started at the end of the 90s in California around people like Joe Lambert and other theater practitioners, media practitioners, who actually wanted to respond to what Selina was mentioning about this ethos around the politics of dignity. And dignity actually, in that case, was about voice. How can we give voice to those people who are not always heard? And sometimes these people are not heard, not because they don't talk and they don't tell their stories, but because they don't have the vehicle, they don't have the medium to actually make their story visible. And therefore they invented this incredible, powerful tool over the years that now we call digital storytelling. And it's a template. So every time we have a template, it's our job then to disrupt that template and make it work. But it's a good template for us to use and adapt and think about the feasibility of different projects and the feasibility of different outcomes through this process. So just to give you a short summary of what it is, it's a workshop-based activity that is, generally speaking, divided into 5 steps. The researcher is not longer researcher, becomes a facilitator and part of the process, is embedded in the process, and is more like a creative practitioner with some knowledge of the process, but no knowledge of the subjects that they are going to express. It starts with what we would call a story circle, where we would invite people, sometimes through object-based activities, to share a first-person narrative. So a story that is relevant to the theme that they want to address as a community, as a group. And then we've been talking about language, and I found that fascinating. I'm actually writing right now something about using digital storytelling in multilingual, multi-language environments and how we cope. I'm bilingual, sort of, because I'm better in Italian, but I try to be bilingual. So my brain doesn't work in the same way in the 2 languages. So I'm very much aware of how translation, it happens and is supported by creativity, and how we adjust things we may want to express through different languages. And by language, I don't mean just Italian and English, but I mean, the verbal language in a story circle. Or what happens in the second step, that is when we ask our participants to write down a script. So what's the difference between a story that we would tell in 5 minutes compared to the story that we need to contain into under 50 words? How do we translate those emotions that we were able to generate in a safe space, in an intimate space with other people, knowing that we were listened by other people on a piece of paper? And then translation happened again in the process in the 3rd step, when we actually ask participants, co-researchers, people, community members, to translate their script into a voiceover. So actually, they perform their own narrative. They read it, but it's not just about reading as it was like a piece of, I don't know, on a newspaper, but they really need to put their own emotions and sentiments on that text, thinking about their audience, thinking about that their story is a story that will be heard, is a story that must be listened to. And then translation happen again, even if we are still using the same language in terms of literary, like English or Italian or any other language we are working on. We need to translate it into a piece of media. So a digital story is a video in which we combine visuals, still images, footage with a voiceover. So the beauty of that transition to this medium is actually that the voice we just recorded in the 3rd step needs to become, in the 4th step, a video, a 2 minutes video. So the multimodality of the object, the video, is about making those 2 languages create a dialogue. So we are not going to repeat in the visuals what we are saying. So actually we are trying to explore our emotions, diving a bit deeper, and therefore share our inner knowledge into something that can trigger emotions in our own audience. And then there is the 5th step, that is actually where the loop is closed. And the community that were together in the story circle in the 1st step, they come together again to watch those films that have been created during this process. So that's the conventional model. And the screening that happens at the end is a sort of magic gathering, because the people have been witnessing those translations from the original narrative, the original story, into the final output. So I think the best way of explaining what a digital story is actually sharing a digital story. So while you were talking, I actually thought about a story that was memorable, because one of the beautiful things of storytelling, of digital storytelling, is that there is this beautiful process that is a collective journey where we share knowledge, we dismantle knowledge hierarchies, we create spaces for intimacy and dialogue. And then there is this object that is created at the end. And then the potential of using this, I call object the story, the digital story, the film, the video. Then that video has got its own life, can be kept as an intimate thing, or can be actually published and therefore have additional audience members, additional feedback from other people. So I'm going to share now a story. Then I'll come back and I'm going to want to just reflect on a couple of things we've been talking about with Andy and Selina, where we were thinking about how to adapt our approaches to the GenViR network. So let's watch the story first. This story was made actually by a former PhD student at the Montfort University. It's a beautiful story about the role of creativity in healing. And she was involved in a conventional digital storytelling workshop. Therefore, she went through these 5 steps with a group of 20 students coming from all over Europe. So we had people using different national languages that coming together, all of them, to talk about and reflect on the impact of creativity in their own personal lives.
When people see my job title, they think she's creative. They're not wrong, but it's not because I make films or write stories, or at least my creativity is not defined by pretty images or unrestricted abstraction. That is imagination. Creativity is a state of mind. It's a type of problem solving. In fact, so much of filmmaking is about ticking boxes or following formulas. It's about deciding scope, actively listening, and then organizing content to fit that plan. These are tools of creativity, but to use the tools, you first need to know what you are trying to achieve and what the restrictions are to achieving it. In 2017, my goal was to be heard, to go part way in describing the messy emotions of the human condition. There were no words that could adequately describe my emotional experience. They needed to be felt to be understood. So the film I made was almost entirely silent. Most of my trauma was not experienced in the moment that caused it. Rather, the replaying of memories, every time slightly different to the last, was painful, because we are never taught how to react to the realization that the abstractions of our mind can lie to us. So, the film I made was a beautifully messy abstraction. What hurt about these memories was my part in them, the weakness of naivety and blind trust, the relentless optimism that chose to ignore all opportunities to escape. So, I made sure that they were not the focus of the story. In fact, they became a mere shadow, barely entering the screen. Most importantly, I made this film to communicate to my community that to heal, I didn't need justice, I needed help in rediscovering self-love. So, the narrative became between me and myself. If I could go back in time, would I stand and judge like I do in my thoughts? The answer was no. The answer was that I would do everything in my power to tell her it was okay and that it was not her fault. This was the only line of dialogue between the characters in my film, a simple stop, followed by a hug. My goal was to be heard, to go part way in describing the messy emotions of the human condition. Here are my family watching this film in the cinema. Here are my local community rewarding me for voicing my perspective. I was not only heard, but my voice celebrated. This is what drives me to solve a much bigger problem, to make the business case for the entire arts for health industry. So when people look at my profile and they think, she's creative, they're not wrong. But it's not because I make films or write stories. No. My creativity is defined by my awareness of all the intricacies of this big problem. It is my ability to recognize which limitations can and cannot be changed, and my determination to discover something new in the face of that knowledge that sparks my most creative results.
So I wanted to share this particular digital story because I think it's quite relevant with the subjects and the kind of issues we are trying to reflect on here. Of course, I don't want to take too much time because I'm aware that we got only around 10 minutes to have the discussion with all of us. But I hope this gives you an idea of what digital storytelling is as a conventional model and what digital story is as a conventional output. But what happens in our research is never repeating the conventional model and is never expecting that the conventional output will be created. So I think the beauty of being co-researchers, as Selina was saying, is actually in that openness that Andy was alluding to. The openness of each of us as individuals, as researchers, as human beings, to actually also sometimes stay in that uncomfortable space of being prepared to be unprepared, and therefore go in a space ready to be surprised and ready mainly to listen to the space and to the people who are in that space and to their needs, to make sure that those tools we are aware of can be adapted, adjusted for the good use of this, hopefully, long-term partnerships.
Thank you. Thank you, Antonia. I just my personal reaction to that is like how much unlearning needs to happen from the traditional training if you're coming not from maybe theater or arts. So I'm a psychologist. So for me, the process to get to the space where you create the space in the research was unlearning the traditional way of how you do science or how do you do research. It's very much, I need to shed all that to be able to do and connect and create those spaces. So thank you very much for your talk. And yes, I'll open up the floor for questions to Antonia or to all our speakers. We have some time to have a discussion as well. There's a question from Deepika. So it's about if you wanted to unmute maybe, and or I can read it as well. Nope. So the question was, it's acting up. No, that's fine. I'll read it out. No problem. So thank you, Selina. Just follow-up question on the same. Since most of the participants must be working and typically start working at young age because of economic situations, were there any hurdle in getting participants or for people to come forward? And I think that's probably everybody has experienced that in their research.
Yeah, it's a big one, but it's about the timing often. So if we're working with young people, we tend to work between 6 and 10 at night because they've quite often finished their work. They're still awake. We provide snacks and food, obviously, and transport. If we're working with the women from Worley Collywater, then it's very much about the middle of the afternoon because that's the time that they describe it as their nap time, the time that they have to sleep. So we work in their sleep time. If it's the young people from UVA, we pay them to do residential courses with us. So we pay them wages because they are co-researchers in every possible way. So they are paid to attend as researchers, and their accommodation and food is paid for while they're with us. But those are just 3 examples. It's about finding the gaps in people's lives where they have the space for it, or making a space viable by paying them as employees of the project, and also by making it fun so that they want to be there. That's absolutely part of the process. So it's working with your partnerships to work out when's the best time, and to make sure that what you're doing is engaging, interesting, fun and lively, so that they will make space for it where they can. But that's been my experience of it.
Antonia?
Yeah, just to add to that, something that I found very useful, especially with our long-term partners in Kenya, for example, is that train the trainers model, and also the fact that then they would learn a new skill in becoming themselves facilitators of digital storytelling workshops. That could be also a good skill to have for new jobs or getting new job opportunities for future projects in their own community. And therefore they become a sort of ambassadors of this methodology, but also they are actively looking for opportunities to reapply it and expand in their own context.
Andy?
Just to say as well that in my experience of working with people that are refugees and asylum seekers, very often will join a project because they want something out of it or think they'll get something out of it that is very different to what is on offer. And again, so there's a real question of really kind of talking that through, what can and cannot be done, because very often you become somebody in a position of power and you represent a whole load of organizations that you're not even connected to. and suddenly you're able to be the conduit to a passport or a visa or something. So you have to really be aware of how you are perceived, the power structures that lie behind you, and however much you may go into the room as an individual and try and break all that down, you may be being read very differently by the participants, and you need to be aware of that. I think really unpick that.
I think it goes back to some of the impact as well that we kind of were discussing as well, is what kind of impact you're talking about with even having co-researchers as part of your research space, in terms of their kind of life and experience and everything else. But we found even in so the GenViR network, the kind of community collaborations that we're going into, how much information local NGOs have in terms of when do you go in and how do you go in. So even doing workshops with the Hijra community or women, who've experienced domestic violence, even running a workshop, no, they want a whole day. If they're taking time out and they're losing wages, and yes, we're reimbursing them, but they want a day engagement. Actually, for them, they have childcare. They want half a day on 2 days. So it's that kind of translation and information that local NGOs have that we as researchers from outside the context just do not possess. We can design a workshop that we say, we start at 10, we finish at 3. It's very logistical kind of thing. We're like, that's what it is. We'll break for lunch. We'll do this. And you go in, like, that's not possible. They have lives, they have childcare, they have jobs and everything else. And suddenly it becomes that kind of breaking of the model and breaking of, wait, we can't do story circle in this time. We need to do something else. We need to start with play or activity or food or something. So it's very much even that community that you go into, the demographic that you're going into, it will look different, and you can't plan for that. You always need to translate with local knowledge of hours, activities, language, everything else is very much needs to kind of adapt to that. At least that's what's our experience here as well. But yeah, we would not be able to do that without the local NGO partners that we have. Ali's here, who is helping us with that process. Yes, Anik.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that. It's linked kind of to the conversations that we've had with colleagues on the GenViR network who are actually doing some of that work out in India at the moment, is being able to, I always talk a lot about this, the hearing and the listening. Are we hearing people, are we listening to people? Being able to read the room, understand the sensibilities of the room, understand how what you're saying is being understood in an embodied sense. So even before the process kicks off, even before you'll get a feel for the space. So going back to Andy, to your point about it being an embodied process, I think even that entry point needs to be quite an embodied understanding of how is this information being received? Is there an issue on what people perceive it to be, what it actually is? But reading the room was something that even I think in a very real sense, I think Nadia and I had this experience when we were talking with some of the community members in India earlier this year. And we knew in our minds what we wanted to ask. But when we actually got into the space, there was a clear reading of the room and the narrative where we kind of looked at each other and said, this isn't the right time. This isn't the right time to ask this question. This isn't the right. So having that sensibility, being quite heightened to the environment, I think having that sense of, I need to read what's going on here in a non-literal sense, in a very embodied, people's body language says a lot. And I think, I just wanted to make that point. Thank you.
That's how the rooms are designed even. I think it's the small things, we can talk about methodology and research design and everything else, and it's all kind of theory-based and evidence-based and everything else. But you enter a room and see a row of chairs around the border of a room, and that division, and you're over here and they're over there, and just that physicality, it's just different. And then until you break that and until you bridge that, and this, even the physical behavior, like leaning forward, trying to do changing the position of the chairs, you don't write that in the methodology. You don't write, you know what I mean? You don't do that. But to have that conversation happen, sometimes it is those little things that physically change the psychology and the connection in the language and the connection in that space.
But going back to what Andy was saying, I think one of the most important key aspects of this different approaches within this context is when it's a non-intrusive investigation. I think this is something we should actually write on our head whenever we start this type of work. Because very often we feel driven by our own interests. We are eager to know more. We are eager to feel accepted. We are eager to be a part of that community. We think that our practice is exceptional, but this could be intrusive actually. So how to avoid that sense of intrusion into a space that we don't know, then that's the challenge.
Benita, you put a comment in the chat, and I wanted to whether you wanted to expand on that.
I think it's just when you're mentioning spaces, the first thing that's coming to mind is that the communities in India are actually, they don't have boundaries. You know, everyone's in each other's business and there's no space. So when we're talking about space and boundaries, that's just that one thing that's standing out so much to me. So the moment that space is created where the boundaries are naturally respected, there's this idea of, oh, I can speak, I can talk, and there is a voice there in whatever form, and there's a natural embodiment that takes place, like you were mentioning, even with the physical space. So I do imagine doing that in a very non-threatening way is really important. And that's why I do imagine that because they're in survival mode so often, the embodiment is not really that of ease and comfort. It's usually about like all guns out and I'm here to defend. So I was just resonating a lot with that.
Lovely, thank you for your comment. I'm very conscious of us being on time. I just wanted to open the floor for our speakers. If you had any last thoughts about the conversations we've had, the final message for us to take away from this. Not to put you on the spot or anything.
Yeah, I might have just one thought that I was telling earlier. I just came back from a fantastic conference in the United States and made me think a lot about the concept. It was linked to tangible heritage, but actually it makes sense within our context too, and was the link between culture and resilience within communities. So I've been thinking about this a lot. So how culture and cultural traditions are so important to build resilience within a community.
Andy, Selina, any thoughts? No.
Mine is, it's just really great to be in different spaces. The Zoom is really not a great medium for conversations, which makes this really hard. But I think the conversations between the interdisciplinary conversations and interdisciplinary practice, those words are bandied about all of the time. And I think where it becomes exciting is where we, in the same way as the researchers and co-researchers from communities need to be together and not have those divides. I think the more we can bring the divides down between different disciplines and have networks and projects like this, the more exciting the work gets, the more the possibilities open and the less extractive research becomes, if that makes sense. And yeah, it's just echoing that, really, that I think it's really dynamic to have so many different disciplines and practitioners who work in very different ways in a space working together is really exciting.
Brilliant.
And I suppose just to say again about the importance of play and how always surprised people are by how much they enjoy it and how speedily, with the right games, things can happen remarkably. You might think, oh my God, and then with, just play some games sometimes that have got nothing other than having some fun. Yeah.
I think that's a good point. Thank you very much again for our speakers. I think there was a very, very informative and illuminating discussion. And thank you for our participants to join in and ask questions. We have the next session, same time, same place next week. And we will be talking about more on, correct me if I'm wrong, sensitive research and vulnerable spaces. So again, going very much deeper into the conversations around how we accommodate that in our research. So again, thank you very much, everybody, and I hope to see you all next week.